My name is Dr. Sam Turner, and I'm the Director of Archaeology here at the St. Augustine Lighthouse Museum with the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program, or LAMP. And one of my fields of expertise is the contact period when the Spaniards first came to the New World. And one of those Spaniards was this fellow, Juan Ponce de León, who has something to do with our state's history. So that's what we're talking about today. So many of you who have been here in town or who have been visiting have noticed this beautiful bronze that we have out in front of the parque of Ponce de León. The identical statue and the identical stand, as you can see here from the top, stands in San Juan, Puerto Rico, outside the cathedral, which you can see here in the background. A lot of people know about Ponce's discovery of Florida, but they don't know much about Ponce before the discovery of Florida, or his involvement with the island of Puerto Rico, or Hispaniola for that matter. Well, with a name like Juan Ponce de León, you know he's a Spaniard. He was born in the province of Valladolid, which is in northern Spain, in this region, south of Asturias. And he was born in the town of San Tervas de Campos. This is a recent Google Earth image of San Tervas de Campos. The most recent population census has 144 people living in town. Now, I'm sure in the 16th century it was not quite as densely populated. As you can see, this is agricultural land, and so this town made its subsisted on agriculture and livestock. And that is what Ponce's young childhood was all about. This is the church where he was almost certainly baptized in San Tervas. They began building this church in the 12th century AD and finished in the 17th century. So exactly which part of the church was there when Ponce was baptized is anyone in this room's guess, but if you went there and you talked to the priest who ran the place, he could probably tell you most likely where that was. So, Ponce was born in 1474, and he was the illegitimate son of a Spanish nobleman. The Ponce de León family was a very important family in the Reconquest. In particular, they were instrumental in taking Cádiz, which is a major seaport in Spain. And so he's the son of one of those Ponce de Leóns. He, at the age of 10, possibly with the assistance of his father, was placed in an apprenticeship role. He was made the page of Pedro Núñez de Guzmán, who was a knight of the military order of Calatrava. And that was a military, an independent military organization like the Knights Templar or St. John the Hospitallers. But in the 1480s, when that Grand Master of that order died, he was replaced by another person, and when that transition occurred, King Ferdinand took the order under his control. So they went from being an independent military order to a royal military order, loyal to the king. And that was always one of Juan Ponce's hallmarks. He was always loyal to the king, and in all the political fighting that occurred in the New World, he always stayed loyal to the king. So as he grew up under this knight, learning the trade of war and fighting, the final conquest of Spain was underway. And so when he was 13, that's another thing. I have numbers in brackets next to dates. And that's Juan Ponce's age in that particular year. And I think it's when you're thinking about a historical character, it's worth thinking about how old that person was when certain things happened in their life, because depending on where you are in your life's story, you're impacted by certain events in a particular way. So in 1489, at the age of 15, a number of other cities fell. And at this age, at 15, he's probably involved in fighting at this stage. Not so much hanging back in camp, making sure that his knights' spurs are polished and all that, but he's actually in combat. And by 1492, when he's 18, he definitely would have participated in the final conquest of Granada, the capital of the last kingdom, the last Moorish kingdom in Spain, Al-Andalus. So Granada and the kingdom of Granada was in this region here in southern Spain. And so the fall of Granada in 1492 represented the end of 800 years of Arabic culture in the Iberian Peninsula. A culture that was renowned for its learning, its appreciation of art, its bloody infighting, lots of things, but it was the end of that world in 1492. This is an illustration of some of the Moorish soldiers and their gear that Ponce would have been confronting in that final battle. And this is the Alhambra, the palace there in that hilltop fortress, and one of the greatest architectural monuments in Spain to this day. So when this world was coming to an end in 1492, another very important event occurred, which was Columbus's voyage to the New World, which began the end of another world, that world being the world of the various Native American peoples over here, because their cultures were about to be impacted by disease and steel. So Columbus came back from his first voyage, and the situation in Spain at the time was you had these military orders, you had all these soldiers, and the war was essentially over. And for 800 years, there had been this culture. It was a martial culture, pretty much geared to war. So there were all these guys hanging around with nothing left to do. Now, Juan Ponce was very well connected because his knight was a very high status knight. He would eventually become the head of that order. So he got a berth on one of the 17 ships that composed Columbus's second fleet that went to the New World in 1493. And that is when he arrived. On the first voyage, the Santa Maria had been wrecked, and the crew left there in a fort called La Navidad and found that the Spaniards had all been recently killed. The bodies were, well, they weren't quite warm, but I mean, the event had just happened. They found some floating in the creek and all. And it appears that relations had gone bad. So he decided that he wasn't going to settle right there. He'd head down the coast to the east, which would also put him closer to the gold-bearing interior of the island, which was what he was there to do. He was there to trade for gold. So Juan Ponce de León went ashore with the 1,200 other colonists in 1493. And this marked the very beginning of Spanish presence in the New World. And it was to be a permanent presence. So the climate was not what the Spaniards were used to. Their supplies started to go bad. They traded initially with the local Taino Indians for food, but that trade tapered off. The Spaniards ate a lot. Dietarily speaking, they ate 3 or 4 times as much as the locals did. So they quickly ate everybody out of house and home. And that, of course, led to conflicts, as you can imagine. So Columbus decided that what he needed to do is he needed to reduce the Spanish population in Isabela, and at the same time establish control over the gold-bearing interior of the island. So he sent about 500 men. They all marched inland. Columbus went with them, blaring trumpets, shooting cannons and guns to make a very big show. And they got inland, they set up a fort, and then Columbus went back to Isabela and left 500 men there under the command of a man named Pedro Margarit. And Pedro Margarit was himself a knight of a military order of Alcántara. And so it's my belief that because Ponce de León was formally attached to a military order, he probably appealed to this man as somebody he could trust to follow orders and do as he was told. And so I believe that Ponce had left Isabela and went into the interior at this time. One of the most important things about Ponce de León is that he actually survived this whole beginning, because a lot of Spaniards didn't. Hundreds and hundreds died of disease and starvation, and he did not. So they were in the interior, and the discipline in the fort sort of went away. They were just out in the woods. The barter for gold went away because the Indians quickly bartered all the gold they had, and then they didn't have any more. And there was still the food problem. So the Spaniards just started disappearing into the forest, and Pedro Margarit didn't like the situation at all, went back to Isabella, took a ship for Spain, and never came back. So I have from 1498 to, let's see, 94 to 98, gone native. He basically mixed in with the Taino population. He learned their language, he learned their food ways, he learned how they fought. And of course, you have hundreds of Spaniards now in the interior, and in some cases, they're living with the Tainos and getting along well, and in other cases, they're not. So in the cases that was not happening, eventually became violent, and so war broke out. And so in 1495, there's something called the Battle of the Vega, and it was a huge Indian army was raised, and essentially the Spaniards mustered everybody that they could to fight in that battle. And so it's probable that Ponce de León fought in the Battle of the Vega in 1495 at the age of 21. So then gold was found on the south coast, which was a really good thing because all the barter gold was gone and the enterprise was looking financially bankrupt. And the king and the queen were like, I don't know, this deal's not really working out for anybody. But then they found all these gold nuggets in the river. And Columbus went back with a sample. The king was very happy. And so the Spanish venture continued. In 1497, there's a rebellion against Columbus authority. And Ponce was almost certainly not involved in that rebellion. First of all, that rebellion occurred in Isabella, because when the gold find happened on the south coast, Bartholomew Columbus, who'd been left in charge, took all his buddies and his retainers and his confidants down to the south coast to begin mining gold, and everybody else was left in Isabella with not much food and no career prospects, shall we say. So it's no surprise that they rebelled. One of the men who rebelled played a prominent role in a military campaign that Ponce de León also played a role in. And Las Casas, who is a chronicler, describes this one gentleman as having been one of the rebels who had fought with Francisco Roldan against the Columbuses. And Ponce is never mentioned as being involved in that. And so I think, A, he wasn't in Isabella, and B, he was a king's man. He would not have engaged in that sort of activity. But there was a 7-month standoff as these guys stood out a fort in the middle of the island where Bartholomew Columbus was holed up. And then a ship came bearing the news that actually the Columbuses are still in power, and Bartholomew's been given a big fat promotion. So all those rebels went to the western part of the island, and they set up their own little kingdom, essentially. And that proved problematic later. So the Columbuses were eventually fired by this guy, Francisco de Bobadilla, who was sent to investigate what was going on. And the economic situation on the island was dire. Ponce was probably involved in gold mining at this time because he was involved in gold mining later. And so what Bobadilla did to alleviate the economic situation and to make everybody like him was he lifted the king's gold tax. He said, no more taxes on gold. He overreached his authority a bit on that. So the king was not pleased, and he sent this fellow, Nicolás de Ovando. Nicolás de Ovando was also of a military order, and the king said to him, you know, there's a lot going wrong with that island. I need you to go there, and I need you to take care of it and do what you have to get that island under complete Spanish royal control. I don't want problems with the Indians. I want everybody to obey the law under the king's command. And so he did that. He arrived, and he brutally suppressed the Indians on the western and central part of the island. And then there were a couple of military campaigns on the eastern end of the island in Higüey. Higüey was not gold-bearing. It was agricultural, and it produced a lot of the bread, it was called cassava bread, that went to support the gold mining operations. The other thing about Nicolas de Ovando he was very, very close politically to Ponce's old boss, Pedro Núñez de Guzman. So then when Ovando arrives in the New World, Ponce's political status went straight to the top, because now his old master's buddy is here, the governor. So he's also a military order man. Ponce is a military order man. So in 1504, the Second War breaks out in Higüey, and Juan Ponce is made the commander of the troops from Santo Domingo. And this is the first time you see Ponce de León coming forth and being described in the chronicles, discussing the New World. All that comes before that is pretty much just worked out based on what was happening there. So after the province is conquered, Ponce is made essentially the governor of the province. He's made lieutenant of the province, and he's told to establish 2 settlements, which he does. As I mentioned, it's not gold-bearing. So they all set up ranches and farms and produce cassava bread and salt pork. And Ponce himself was into cattle ranching. Again, I think that goes back to his roots in Spain. So this is the eastern province of Higüey, and this is the town he set up, Salvaleón de Higüey, which was actually on a river called the Yuma River, which comes out right here. And so there was a port there. And the mining, these are all like mining regions. So there was a huge mining industry here, and that just sucked in all the bread and all the salt pork and anything that was comestible into that zone. So when you had Spanish ships that would arrive and unload their cargoes, that they needed to resupply to head back to Spain. And the prices of bread were very expensive, and often they couldn't get what they needed to cross the Atlantic. So they would just come along the coast here, anchor up in Ponce's harbor, and get whatever they needed at reasonable cost. So these guys were all making good business on supplying the mine region and supplying vessels going back to Spain. But there was also cross-passage traffic between the Taino Indians of San Juan Bautista, which is what we know today as Puerto Rico, and Española. And news got to Ponce that there was gold on that island. So he went to Ovando and said, I'd like to go across and I'd like to explore that island and prospect and see if we can't find some gold there and start mining. And Ovando was good with that. So in 1506, he takes 3 ships and he anchors off the west coast. They go ashore. They actually settle into a community here known as Mampo el Grande, and in what would later become San Germán, and explore the island, where they find this wonderful bay here and eventually begin prospecting and mining operations here. In 1508, he goes back to Ovando, and they basically get a contract, and he takes another load of people and he lands on the south coast with those guys and sets up some businesses here. This is the coat of arms for the town of Salvaleón, which he settled. This is part of the ennobling process. And this is the mouth of the Yuma River. So Ponce, who had lots of experience in how not to run a colonial venture, decided that he wanted to do things differently in Puerto Rico. So what he did was he did not want to impact the natives' food supply as much as was normal. So he imported his mining supplies from his harbor here at Yuma, and also from Mona Island, so as to feed his miners without having ugly things happen with the natives. And this is just a beach that probably would have seen quite a bit of activity in those days. And this is all at Yuma. And this is where the barge traffic would have been, boats carrying salt pork and bread to the vessels, which then would have transported it to San Juan, or gone on to transatlantic ships. So when Ponce settled in an area, he would build a stone house. This is his house in Salvaleón. The house would serve as essentially the government center there in the province. So all the government records were kept there. The government arms were kept there, and the treasury was kept there. And so if there was a rebellion, it would also serve as the stronghouse. Most other structures were wood and thatch and that sort of thing. So when he went to Puerto Rico, he did the same thing. He set up a stone house in Caparra. It became essentially a hallmark of his colonial practices. So things were going really nicely in Puerto Rico. He had a good little deal going there. He brought his family over. But in 1509, all that changed because Diego Columbus was appointed the governor of the New World at that time. And that was a political favor that King Ferdinand had to pay back to a duke who had supported him when he came back to Spain after the death of Queen Isabella to keep things from blowing up. So he did not particularly like Diego Columbus. Diego Columbus had grown up in his household and he knew him all too well. And Diego Columbus was a proud, I was going to say Spaniard, but he was of Genoese descent. But he was very, very jealous of his father's contract, and he held the king to the letter of that contract. What were his rights as the heir, and what were the king's rights? And the king and the queen never in their wildest dreams imagined that there was this huge Americas thing on the other side of the ocean. They expected Columbus to go over and set up trading stations. And so the contract was sort of designed that way. So when Diego Columbus heard about the deal that the king had going with Ponce, he became infuriated. And even before he left Spain for the New World, he started to undo that. And at the same time in 1509, the king had also granted a couple of contracts for people to go and settle in tierra firme in what is today Colombia and Panama. And he interfered with those operations once he got to the New World, and in fact was responsible for quite a few Spaniards dying there because of the supply issues, because he basically embargoed the expeditionaries' properties. So what he did in the case of Puerto Rico was he appointed some of his officials to run Puerto Rico, and they went over to Puerto Rico where Ponce was happily mining away with his friends and family, and 150 settlers went with them. So they landed in Puerto Rico and they established a town in San Germán on the west coast. And the first thing they do is they distribute the Indians. It was, the term was called repartimiento, and it's what was done on Espanol. It's like, okay, this chief and his people are going to take care of you and serve you. And you'll tell them what to do and they'll do it. That's the system that was set up. And Ponce had not installed that system there. So when the Columbus officials imposed that system there, that caused a lot of friction, and that led to a rebellion in 1511. But the king did not, there were countermoves. The king appointed Ponce governor, and he had the decree smuggled to his treasurer in Santo Domingo, who then put it on a vessel and had it smuggled into Puerto Rico and given to Ponce, because he didn't want Diego to get any news of it. He didn't want him confiscating the paperwork, for one thing. So Ponce gets this decree in 1510 that he is the governor. So he gets his supporters. He says, I have an important announcement. I need you all to be present. Come to the plaza. And he calls the officials, and they all get together there. And he opens it up and says, I, the king, appoint Juan Ponce de León governor of Puerto Rico. And Columbus's officials said, well, that's not valid. That's not legal. He can't do that. He doesn't have that power. That's not in the contract. We are the political appointees on this island, and you are not. You're not the governor. At which point Ponce said, well, you can explain that to the king in person. You're under arrest. And he shipped them to Spain under arrest. Just made them go away. He actually did it by embargoing a ship that was in the harbor at the time that belonged to one of those officials, and persuading the captain of that vessel, who worked for one of these officials, to take his boss to Spain under arrest and essentially work for Ponce after that and represent Puerto Rico as a procurador, or essentially their representative in the king's court. So he did that. And that triggered a court case. The king, Diego Columbus, sued the king. And the king lost on a number of counts. He lost he did not have the rights to appoint political officials. And the court's like, there it is, black and white in the contract. You can't argue with that. But the right to appoint Indian labor was something that belonged to the king. So the political fight after that was over the Indian labor, because the Indian labor represented the wealth. The Indians worked in the mines. The Indians took care of the cattle herds. The Indians worked in the fields. So whoever had the Indians had the wealth. While the court case is going on, the Indian rebellion breaks out in 1511. Ponce puts it down, more or less. He establishes some control over the island, but an alliance between the Taino Indian of San Juan and the Carib of the Windward and Leeward Islands has occurred. And so now they're fighting, basically they're in big Indian wars. And for the next 20 or 25 years, the island would not be at peace. There would be raids all the time. But there was some semblance of control. And so then in 1512, after the case has been decided, the king sends the same officials back with instructions from him. So the king is now exerting some authority over these Columbus appointees by saying, okay, I'm appointing you. So he's like, I'm appointing you now, and I'm giving you responsibilities in terms of defense and what you're going to do. So he was exerting control in that manner. But they show up in 1512 and establish the town of San Germán. And Ponce is left without a job, so to speak. But there's other things that have been going on to the north. This is an image of Ponce landing on the south coast in 1508. I probably should have had that earlier on in the slideshow. It's obviously a very romantic depiction of what that meeting would have been like. I don't know if Ponce was a redhead or not, but he's depicted as such here. So this was the town of San Germán that was set up by the Columbus faction. This is Ponce's settlement over here. The capital was called Caparra, and the king eventually referred to it as Puerto Rico because there was a lot of gold coming out of it. It was a rich port. And over time, the island name and the capital name changed. So now it's the island of Puerto Rico and the capital is San Juan. So when this operation got going, a trade sprang up between these two islands. And this inter-island trade, during the early period, when I say early, like 1512, 1513, when the Columbuses are in charge, it's all the inter-island trade is going here. So this is the big economic hotspot where all the business is. Ponce is out here. He gets some ships calling from Spain, but there's not as much. I mean, the gold mining's good, but there's not as much inter-island trade going on. But what this has caused, this race between, some of the products of actually the inter-island trade were wooden gold mining pans, like for carrying the ore and for washing it in the water. They were called bateas de lavar y de servicio. Cotton hammocks and shirts. Cotton was a big crop as well. And salt pork were also. And these were the products of the inter-island trade. They were agricultural products, because when Spaniards left the island of Hispaniola to go to another island, they were interested in gold mining. They weren't interested in planting crops. So they immediately became dependent on imported food services, as it were. So this trade sprang up. This was the disaster that almost completely went away in Tierra Firme. There was gold here. There was gold in Puerto Rico, and there was gold in Cuba. Jamaica had no gold. It was like Higüey. So they exported comestibles and cotton products. And so this system sprang up where you have, agricultural products being exchanged for gold. And this is the earliest European sort of commerce that got set up in the New World. And Ponce himself engaged in this commerce. These are the trade routes. There are some wonderful documents that have survived. These are the factor's accounts for the king's factor was essentially his business manager. And they kept a very detailed record of money owed, money in, money out, that sort of thing. So one of the things they kept track of was customs and imports and exports. And so this shows in 1512, San Cristobal was the name of the vessel. And he's importing. This first record doesn't have details, but just says vacas y otras cosas. And he's bringing them into San Germán. So Ponce is engaging in the cattle business in San Germán, which is actually a settlement controlled by his political enemies, but there's still good business there. So he's doing business there. And in Puerto Rico, he's importing cattle as well. He brings in 4 bulls and then 4 heifers, most likely. And he's already been here for a while, and he has a cattle herd. And so what you have to do if you're breeding and raising cattle is you have to bring in, other bloodlines, because otherwise, you have one bull and he's daddy to everybody, and that just isn't good after a while. So he's essentially improving his herds here. This part of the trade record occurs after the voyage to Florida, and we'll probably discuss that a little bit later. He also occasionally had things that were unloaded for him from some of these ships by some of the men who were his associates and worked for him. In this case, a horse was unloaded. And actually, there's this wonderful reference in these records to the vaquero of Juan Ponce de León, this guy named Alonso González Molano. A vaquero, of course, is the American translation is cowboy, but a vaquero was somebody who was a herdsman. He ran the cattle herds. This is probably the earliest reference to vaqueros in the New World that has come to my attention anyway. So, Ponce also owned ships, and these, he owned the Santiago and the Santa Maria de Consolación. And his ownership, as it survives in the records, suggests that he only owned ships because he was going to go on this trip to Florida. He was not, he'd unload things from other merchant vessels, but he was not engaged as a ship owner so much himself, at this time anyway. So this is the Santiago, which arrived from Spain in September of 1512 in anticipation of his trip to Florida. He already had the contract from the king to go explore to the north. And so here we have these 2 records, 14 and 15. These voyages represent the actual customs documents that were drawn up when the expedition was dispatched to Florida. Everybody knows that, a lot of people know that the expedition left from Puerto Rico, but actually it organized in Española, in Ponce's home port, where he had all his buddies from the war in Higüey and his properties. Discuss that. So the fleet, as I mentioned, 2 caravels. The Santiago was under Diego Bermudez, who brought it over from Spain, and Anton Alaminos was the pilot. Alaminos was an experienced Bahamas pilot, which meant that he was engaged in the slave trade, because that was the only reason people went up there. Ponce de León sailed on the Santiago. The Santa Maria de la Consolación was under the sailing master Pedro Bello, and Juan Bono de Quejo is given the title of captain, and in this case it represents his position in the overall expedition hierarchy. He's the second in command of the expedition. He's also shipmaster in his own right. And then we get to the Bergantin, San Cristobal. Now, the only written source that we have that discusses Ponce's trip to Florida is by a man named Herrera, who wrote in the late 16th century, consulting documents that were made on the voyage. And he describes the San Cristobal as a Bergantin. But there are also customs documents which discuss the return of this vessel from the expedition to Florida and describe it as a caravel. So there's a conflict between Herrera and the customs documents, and it's a real pain in the behind, because it means we don't know. Well, it looks like the San Cristobal was a ship that was sent out. I'm getting ahead of myself. So anyway, the fleet consisted of 3 caravels or 2 caravels and a Bergantin. It's not certain we'll ever know for sure, because Herrera's the only source we have, and if we throw Herrera out, then where were you, right? Okay.
Can you tell the difference between the caravel and the Bergantin?
Yes, indeed. This is a Bergantin,
okay.
right? Yeah, we're going there, yeah. It was essentially a galley. It was oared. You could take them in and beach them. And so this craft was the craft of preference for the Indian Wars, the Carib Wars that were occurring at that very time. They were also used for going up creeks and rivers for collecting water for the ships. And like I say, landing and recovering troops. So they could be sailed and or rowed. So when they were used in a military capacity, they would sail and approach an island, but at sea, drop the sail and then get on the oars, because that dropped their profile and they could just shoot in and really surprise the Caribs. Whereas you could see a tall, a caravel or a now coming from miles away because they had these big billowing sails. And this is a caravel, more or less. It was, later ships had galleys down below, but in those days they cooked on basically an iron sort of hibachi arrangement on deck, which meant that if it was really bad weather, you didn't have a hot meal. So these were the sort of ships that Columbus sailed as well. The caravels are pretty well known and famous for that. So, Ponce is considered the discoverer of Florida, but we know that Florida was actually discovered before 1513. Herrera, in his account of Ponce's voyage, opens up by saying, well, having had news that there's things to the north, Ponce then undertook this venture. And this is a 1511 map, 2 years before the trip to Florida. And it was published by a man named Peter Martyr, who was an Englishman who worked as a tutor for the king and queen's children in Spain. And so he had great access, and everybody comes back from the New World, he'd talk to him, interview him, take notes. And so he wrote this great big history, and he published this map. And it was immediately suppressed because they're like, you cannot be giving out maps to the New World to all of Europe. That is not a good idea. So it was immediately suppressed, but some got out. And what it shows us Hispaniola here, which was essentially the center of the Spanish world at that time. Puerto Rico, it's still called San Juan. Cuba, Jamaica, Tierra Firme, right? The coast of South America, Central America. And then this large landmass to the north, labeled Isla de Bimendi Parte, part of the island of Bimini. Okay? Ponce's contract states that he's supposed to go out and discover the secrets of Bimini. So that's what he was doing. He had the contract. He had the rights to make that discovery. Everything was very licensed, still is, right? So this is a good idea of what the average Spanish mariner's geographic knowledge of the New World might have been at this time, unless, of course, they had been sailing along a particular coast and had intimate knowledge of that coast. So the fleet, as I mentioned, it started out in Española, in El Puerto de Yuma. And if you look at the ship traffic that came across the passage, along with Ponce's two ships, there were essentially a fleet of about 5 ships. They all came over within 2 or 3 days of each other. And a number of these other ships had people who were registered on other ships. Basically, they had people who were registered on this ship, that ship, or the other ship. But they were all going to go with Juan Ponce. And so some didn't get on this ship, they got on that ship. And so it was a bit confusing. And Ponce's ships were also carrying livestock. Now, when you carry livestock in a ship, you have to accommodate them. You have to have, slings and sort of stalls. So his ships were rigged for carrying livestock. So what happened was he couldn't stuff his ship with supplies in Salvaleon. So he came across, he unloaded his cattle and his livestock, and then he did the interior modifications, and I believe so supplies were taken from these other ships and put on board those ships, and then the crews all came together at that point in San Germán on the west coast of Puerto Rico. And so on March 4th, they depart, and they sail northwest by north, and after a few days, they arrive in the Bahamas, which were then known as the Lucayos. Now, the Lucayos were also known as the inútiles, the useless islands. And they were useless because they had no gold. So what good could they be? But they did have Indians. And as I mentioned earlier, the Spaniards would go up and capture these Indians and bring them back as slaves to work in the mines and on the ranches. And by 1513, they'd been pretty depopulated. So the fleet travels through these islands, and stops at a number of them where they record the latitude. And then they move on. And then they get to a place called Guanahani, which Guanahani is supposed to have been San Salvador, which was the island where Christopher Columbus first landed in the New World. That's still not clear which island in the Bahamas is the original Guanahani. A lot of scholars persuaded the Bahamian government that it was Watling Island, so they changed that to San Salvador. So now everybody says, oh, well, there's San Salvador, so that must be it. But it doesn't really work like that. But a lot of people like to start Ponce's voyage in the Bahama Islands at San Salvador. So, you know, if you assume that the starting point is one place when in fact we don't really know where it is, it kind of can prove problematic for your theory later on. So they prepare a ship that needed some work there, and they prepared to cross the Golfo de Barlovento, the Windward Gulf. And essentially that's the big water. They knew that they were transitioning. We're leaving the islands now, we're going to go to something else. So they sail across the Golfo, and on March 27th, they sight an island. Now in the text, in Herrera's text, it's described as an island that nobody recognized. Okay, well, Anton Alaminos, who'd been all over those islands, didn't recognize it. None of the other guys who'd sailed in those waters recognized it. So chances are pretty strong it's not one of the Bahamian islands, okay? A lot of theories have it being Grand Bahama, Great Abaco, Man of War Key, Eleuthera, but in fact, it's the coast of Florida. And if you look at the text, the way it reads, traveled, arrived at a named destination in this latitude. Sometimes they don't give the latitude. And in this case, it's like arrived, saw an island, unidentified. Now, if you're looking for the island of Bimini, and you find an unidentified island, do you just pass it by, or do you stop and explore it? I would think that you would stop and explore it. But a lot of theories just say, oh no, that was this island, and they just passed it by. They weren't interested in it, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you look at what happened, so they find this island, and then they sail along in the same direction. They're coasting along the coast of Florida. And they sail for 3 days, coasting to the northwest. And then they hit foul weather. The weather gets bad. And the bad weather lasts till April the 2nd, at which point they approach land and take a latitude reading of 30 degrees 8 minutes. So all this time, from March 27th, they've been sailing the coast of Florida. And in that time, they also had stormy weather, and who knows what that does, right? But when that cleared, they approached land. You want plenty of sea room if you have bad weather, especially if it's like from the northeast. We have no idea where it came from, it doesn't say. But they approached the land and they got this noon shot, 30 degrees 8 minutes. That 30 degrees 8 minutes is located at the top of the GTM NER, or what's Guana State Park, to some of you folks. Now, we know that this latitude reading was taken from board the ship because immediately upon taking that latitude, they continued sailing north for the remainder of the day, and then they anchored in the evening. And then, this is a presumption, of course, but it's a pretty good one, they went ashore the next morning, as opposed to anchoring up at the evening and then going ashore at night, when you can't see anything at all. So, 30 degrees 8 minutes was collected using the best scientific methods of the day. They used an astrolabe tables. And that's what we have. A lot of people put the landing elsewhere. We won't know, we'll never know where he actually landed, because he went north from 30 degrees 8, from that reading, and then he landed. The interesting thing is, Herrera doesn't tell us what he did after he landed. April the 3rd, and he names it Florida, right? And then 5 days later on the 8th, they sail north along the coast. So that's 5 days that they were ashore, presumably, looking around, exploring. The fact that they sailed to the north suggests to me that they were exploring to the south. Because if they'd gone to the north, they might not, they will have known what was up to the north. But they go to the north a little bit, For one day, they sail to the north, and then they turn around and go to the south on April the 9th. So they encounter the powerful Gulf Stream on April 21st for the first time. And this is when Alaminos has the idea that, wow, this is a really powerful current. And, you know, the ships that were going back to Spain at that time were going through the Mona Passage and heading up north and getting there northing and then heading back to Spain. And he's like, man, you could get this thing. This is a conveyor belt. You get on this thing and you're going north. Which is, of course, another reason if you're coasting along the Florida coast offshore, you're probably in this Gulf Stream heading north. So that's when Alaminos made the great observation about the Gulf Stream, which would eventually become the highway back to Spain. And in fact, he would pioneer it during the conquest of Mexico. He was the first to take that route back to Spain with a ship full of gold for the king so that Cortez could get his governorship. It worked. Mid-May, they're along the Florida Keys, which they call the Mártires, or martyrs, because they looked in the distance like suffering men. And the interesting thing about this is they're looking at them from a distance. I mean, they are offshore because they don't want to be anywhere near the Keys because they're shallow, they're reefs. And in this day and age, you sail during the day. If you were in an exploratory voyage and you had no idea where you were, you anchored up at night because you didn't want to run into a reef at night, because that's exactly what happened in the Santa Maria, actually, on the first voyage. So by the 23rd of May, they had either rounded the Marquesa Keys or gone between the Florida Keys and the Marquesas and were up on the west coast of Florida, and probably in a place, Charlotte Bay. And this is where his fate caught him, because the Indians who were in that area were Calusa Indians. They're pretty bellicose, actually, very territorial. And but the thing is, they had these wonderful gold. They were called guanines. They were like these big gold ornaments, like necklaces that would hang here. And those guanines were what Columbus first found in the Bahama Islands, when he said, that's gold, that's worth having. And he would communicate with the Lucayans, where's the gold? And they'd be like down south in Cuba and Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. Well, the gold, there's no gold mines in Florida. So, but he fixated on that gold because that to him was an indicator of good things. So they fought with the Indians there for a while. They did some trade, and then they left to look for some islands that they had heard that lay to the west. And they arrived there on the 21st of June, and they were covered with turtles. And so he called the islands, you know, Las Tortugas, and so they bear that name to this day. And I think the Tortugas and Florida are the two name places that have stuck from that first expedition of Ponce's. Then they departed and they sailed southwest by west, and they sighted land 2 days later. And on the 28th, they anchored and went ashore, and nobody recognized this place. It was the east-west coastline that nobody knew it, but they saw some dogs, and there were signs that there were iron tools. They didn't find tools per se, but they saw things that indicated that iron tools had been used in the area. So they believed themselves that they were in western Cuba. Some people believe that he was actually in Yucatan and therefore discovered Mexico. But it's pretty clear that he was in Cuba, western Cuba, and that the Spanish presence in Cuba at that time was still in eastern Cuba. As a matter of fact, in June of this year, there was a big military push on in Cuba, and the Spaniards were rapidly expanding militarily, but they had not actually gotten to that portion of Cuba. So from there, they decided to head back to the Bahamas. So they sailed back through the Strait of Florida and up the western boundary of the Bahama Islands. And off of one of them, they found a solitary old woman. And this is often where people say Ponce got the legend of the Fountain of Youth from. But the interesting thing, of course, is this occurred after he was in Florida, not before he was in Florida. And in fact, the Fountain of Youth legend is an Indian legend. And the Taino Indians heard that there was a river in Florida and a lake in Florida, or up there to the north, or in Bimini, where, you could be restored to youth. And some people had actually left looking for this and had settled in Florida. And so it's possible that one of the reasons that those Guanines were in Calusa country were because of Indians who were looking for the Fountain of Youth, came up to Florida and established trade links, and therefore that's how gold got into Florida. So then they continued sailing, and at the top of the Bahamas chain they ran into another ship, another Spanish ship with a pilot named Diego Midhuello. Now, Diego Midhuello was credited with the original discovery of the Bahamas by chroniclers. This would have happened before the 1511 map, but the story went that he was slaving in the Bahamas, a storm drove him to the north, there was this great big land, and there were different people there. They were Indians, but not Lucayans. So he did some trade, but then he didn't have a license to take them as slaves, so he didn't. Another Spanish vessel in the Bahamas, not having any luck because they'd been depopulated, said, well, there was that good story about that stuff to the north. Why don't we just say we got hit by a storm and were driven there? So they went to the north, claiming a storm drove them, and met these wonderful people, all very friendly. They invited them on board their ship to show them their ship, and they showed them what their ship looked like below decks, and then they closed the hatch and sailed for Santo Domingo. So that spoiled things. There was a sort of a relation spoiler there between the Indians of Florida and the Spaniards. But he encounters this very same man at the top of the Bahamas chain during his trip. And this was not a good thing. Ponce was not, this was somebody who was like now sticking his, nosing around what he was doing. And Midhuello essentially started shadowing him. So they departed Grand Bahama with Midhuello and company, and they sailed to they were sailing to Florida, but then they changed course. And I think it was because they decided, this guy's just going to follow us wherever we go. And he's either going to try to claim the discovery himself, or worse still, he's going to be like, oh yeah, I've been here before. This is nothing new, which you don't want on your voyage of discovery. There was also the belief at the time, and scholars as well think it's possibly true, that this man was working for Diego Columbus, who was keeping tabs on Ponce. So they went back to the Bahamas, and they were anchored up and got caught. They were windbound for 27 days, which is a long time, and that's a lot of supplies that get consumed. And during the course of that stay, Midhuello's ship drug anchor and was wrecked. Now, I don't know, maybe somebody cut his anchor line on it. But the crew was saved, and I just made that up. I mean, I could see it happening. There's no evidence one way or the other, of course. So now Ponce has 4 crews that he has to feed, and he's got a cruise that's working for somebody else. So what he does is he splits his expedition. He reorganizes one ship, he loads it up with supplies, and he sends it out with Anton Alaminos as the pilot, and this guy Ortubia, who was the captain of the San Cristobal. And the documents say it was the San Cristobal, which came back. So you're not going to send out a Bergantin on an extended 4-month mission, which is what it turned out to be. In any event, Ponce took the remainder of his ships and Midhuello's crew back to Puerto Rico, where he arrives on the 14th of October to find that his town of Caparra has been burnt to the ground by the Carib Indians, not once but twice in his absence, and everything is in an uproar. So he waits patiently for the other ship to return. It returns the next year, February 20th, 1514, after being gone for some 4 months, with the news that they found Bimini, but no Fountain of Youth, or that's how it's reported by the chroniclers. And at this point, Ponce goes to Spain because he's got this Miruello problem. He wants his contract basically renewed. He wants to get the rights to Florida. So he goes to Spain in 1514. And he meets the king, who he hasn't seen for years and years. In fact, it's the first time he's gone back to Spain since arriving in the New World at 19. So he goes to Spain, talks to the king, and he gets his rights to Florida, the settlement rights, all that good stuff. But there's a problem in Puerto Rico. The problem is war, and the Indians, the Carib are attacking the island and burning the place down. So he's got to take care of that first. So go take care of that. He was put in charge of a fleet called the Armada contra Caribes, the fleet against the Caribs. And he was also made Captain General of the island of Puerto Rico. It was a military position, not a political appointment, so the king could do it. Because what was happening on the island was the Spaniards were just going out on cavalry raids and attacking the Indians and enslaving them. And so the king was not pleased with that practice, and so he was told to stop that practice. He was the only man who could authorize military action on the island. So he gets back to Puerto Rico with his fleet and finds that in his absence, the Spaniards there have undertaken their own defense, which, kind of makes sense. And so his fleet was organized in such a way that he could not offer the same rate of pay as these other fleets in Puerto Rico. So nobody wanted to work for him, right? Because he couldn't pay as well. So out of his own pocket, he had to essentially take these vessels and attack the Caribs because he had a royal order, he had to do it. So he did that. He carried out a number of raids against the Carib Islands and brought back slaves, and they were sold at public auction. And then he liquidated the fleet. He's like, I'm done with this, got out of the contract. And then essentially tried to get the island under control. But he wanted to get back to Florida. And so his life got a little more complicated. In 1520, his wife dies. And at the time, he had 4 children, a son who was in the Franciscan monastery on Española, where he was getting educated. He ended up becoming a Franciscan. I don't know if that's what Ponce had in mind, but that's how it worked out. And then he had 3 daughters. So he married his 2 eldest daughters to 2 brothers, the Troche brothers. And the youngest daughter, who was underage, was in the legal custody, I guess, of the eldest sister. And then Ponce organized his trip of settling Florida. And he went to the West Coast, where the gold trinkets lured him. And they landed there, and they tried to set up a settlement, and the locals didn't like them, and they got in a big fight, and he was shot in the thigh with an arrow. His nephew was gravely wounded, and he died at sea. They decided to regroup in Havana, which actually had been founded between the 2 voyages. And so in Havana, his wound grew worse and infected, and so he decided that he needed to put his estate in order. So he gave power of attorney to one of his men to basically take his ships and all the goods and take them to Mexico, because at the time Mexico was just busting open, right? And Cortez was there, and the conquest was underway, and actually the Spaniards were pushed very hard and almost losing. And so he wanted to make some money for his children because he knew he was dying. So he set this all up, and then he died. And there was an official in Havana who was the tenedor de bienes de los difuntos, or the overseer of the goods of the deceased. And they essentially, this guy and his people, essentially took all the property, and they took it to Mexico and sold it and pocketed all the money. And so his heirs were completely defrauded. And that turned into a court case, and I've not been able to determine whether they ever got any money out of that or not. But some years later, his son-in-law, one of his son-in-laws came to Havana, and his remains were taken back to Puerto Rico, and they were interred there. Now, one thing I did want to talk about, I got a little ahead of myself. The 1516 trade is hard to fit in this anywhere convenient. But when he's back in Puerto Rico as Captain General, he's still engaged in the inter-island trade. And what he's doing here, though, is he's importing bread now. Bread and maize, corn, which was used, that was horse fodder, and bateas. And so he's importing basically mining equipment. So he's engaged, he's still mining. He's always mining all the time. So there you go. That explains why we have an identical bronze statue in front of the cathedral in San Juan, where in fact his remains are to this day. So there it is, folks. Ponce de León and the historia. Thank you.